Good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for being here. We have an amazing and another installment for the Just Us movement. My name is Zeno Temple. I'm the founder and executive director of the Just Us movement. And today's presentation is surrounding LGBTQ plus rights, federal protections, and advocacy tools. June is Pride Month, a time where we honor resilience, leadership, and ongoing fight within our communities. Even as federal protections have expanded in recent years, shifting agency policies continue to create uncertainty for LGBTQ plus communities and individuals navigating workspaces, healthcare systems, and public accommodations. This session will also explore the intersectional challenges faced by people of color and learning about the advocacy tools, community resources, and opportunities for engagement. A webinar will be designed for LGBTQ individuals, allies, and youth and service providers, all of the above, and anyone who is able and willing to listen to the information. We really appreciate you all being here. And as of today, June 25th, 2026, the Just Us movement has yet another installment to do so and to educate our communities. Today, we have an amazing speaker. We have someone who is here from GLAD Law, and they'll tell you all about his beginnings and just, where he came from and his background. Thank you so much. And some of the topics that we'll be talking about today before you jump in, Josh, will be Title VII protections, post-stock in Clayton County, EEOC policy rollbacks and practical safety tips for workers, intersectionality and lived experiences of queer people of color, federal protections in healthcare and public accommodations as well. So without further ado, I'd love to pass it over to you, and so you can just give the audience everyone a brief introduction.
Yeah, thanks so much. Thanks for having me. It's great to see everybody. My name is Josh Revenger. I use he, him pronouns, and I'm the legal director of GLAD Law, or GLBTQ Legal Advocates and Defenders. We are nearing our 50th year as an LGBTQ civil rights organization where we use all aspects of the law, litigation, and policy work, and in addition to public education, to try to move forward LGBTQ plus equality. Prior to joining GLAD Law, I was an associate counsel to President Biden in the White House, where I focused on racial justice and equity, and also handled the LGBTQ portfolio there. And then prior to that, I had a zigzag of a career between some private practice, work at the Legal Aid Society of Cleveland doing racial and economic justice work, and also the project on predatory student lending focused on the for-profit college industry. Really looking forward to chatting with you all tonight.
Absolutely. And we're super excited to have you. Thank you so much for taking the time again to come out and speak with us and educate us on these important issues. You spoke a little bit briefly about about your career and some of the things that you've done in the past. So, what is taking you from legal aid to impact litigation, from the White House to now GLAD Law, right? What initially drew you to civil rights and first and foremost LGBTQ advocacy work?
Yeah, for sure. This actually goes all the way back to when I was in high school, and I'm going to age myself here, which is at the same time that I was wrestling with my own sexual orientation. That was kind of at the exact moment that GLAD Law had secured marriage equality in Massachusetts, and there were just a whole slew of amendments being proposed across the country to ban same-sex marriage. And I remember just wrestling with kind of that being used as a political weapon and being used so potently, kind of with my own sexual, or like at the same time, I was trying to reconcile my own sexual orientation. And I remember thinking that I wanted to basically embark on a career where other people didn't feel the way that I was feeling in that moment. And, through college, through law school, through other exploration, I kind of sharpened my understanding about the different structures that led to that power imbalance and kind of the exploitation of the LGBTQ community in that way, and really just became invested in wanting my career to focus on trying to dismantle those underlying structures. And I think, one of the things I've learned in my career is that that can be done in a whole bunch of different ways and across a whole bunch of different issues. Even though the work that I'm doing now with GLAD Law is very different in terms of, how we approach our work from, the work I was doing at the White House, which is very different than kind of the more individual based representation that I was doing at Legal Aid. I do view them all kind of the same ilk in trying to dismantle those structures and systems which lead to inequality in the country.
I was saying, absolutely, what you just said, your last point of seeing them all under the same umbrella, right? And kind of mentioning that and going into that a little deeper, you worked on things like racial justice, economic justice, equity, access to justice, all of these different issues and these pertinent issues. What connections do you see between these movements, and how did you kind of say, all right, I can affect them all. I can affect change in different areas.
I think at their core, the way that I view it is it's all the same power structures that are upholding racism and bigotry and anti-LGBTQ sentiment. It's a white patriarchal capitalist structure that is kind of at the core of all of the sort of historical inequities that we've seen and all of the policies today that we're seeing enacted, which are trying to create different kind of castes of individuals. And so to me, as I have been thinking about different opportunities to engage, I've always said that, I in many ways in like the way that I do my work am more of a generalist, that I'm not wedded just to impact litigation or individual representation or policy work. And it's more that I think there are a lot of different ways to attack those underlying structures, and that someone needs to be using all of those tools in the toolbox to attack them, to do so. And in my career, that's something that I've really also tried to kind of leverage in the work that I've done. And then, we talk about racial justice and economic justice and LGBTQ justice and kind of different categories. And, there are different civil rights groups focused on different issues. And all of the work is intersecting in so many different ways, not only because we're, again, kind of all fighting against that same power structure, but because people aren't a monolith and all of these elements intersect on an individual level. And so they necessarily have to work in tandem with one another.
Absolutely. And you mentioned there was like so many subsections, right? But for those in our audience or maybe who will see this that don't have the legal background, right? What are some of those protections that first and foremost go in the categories of like employment, education, healthcare, and public life? What are some like important legal protections we should have in mind?
So here, I think there are both federal protections and also state protections that folks should be aware of. And I won't go too far on the state side of things just because that is so dependent on where folks are located. But I will just flag that, in Massachusetts, there are really robust non-discrimination protections that exist across different areas. So education, employment, access to healthcare, access to public accommodations, and so forth. And Massachusetts isn't alone in that. There are many other states across the country where, notwithstanding what the federal government is doing and what federal law may or may not allow, states have stepped in to enact really robust protections for their citizens. Federally, though, there are some protections for LGBTQ individuals. The most notable arises in the employment context. And so there was this decision back in 2020, and you alluded to it earlier, called Bostock versus Clayton County, in which the Supreme Court took a look at the federal law that prohibits sex discrimination in the employment context. And what the Supreme Court there said was, if you're discriminating against someone because of their sexual orientation, or you're discriminating against someone based on their transgender status, you're necessarily discriminating against them on the basis of sex. And so that type of discrimination kind of got brought into the ambit of sex discrimination under federal employment non-discrimination law. That case is still good law. It's still binding right now, which means at minimum, it is against federal law to fire someone, refuse to hire someone, or adversely treat them in the terms and conditions of their employment because of their sexual orientation or because they're transgender. One of the things we've been seeing kind of between the Biden administration and the second Trump administration is just where the logic of that can extend. Because There are a whole bunch of other federal statutes that exist that similarly prohibit discrimination on the basis of sex. For instance, Title IX, which is the law that bars discrimination in the education context, that discriminates on the basis of sex. And the same logic that arose in the employment context would seemingly apply to very similar legal language that's in that law in the education context. And so under the Biden administration's interpretation of that was that Title IX, that law, did prohibit discrimination in education based on sexual orientation and gender identity. The Trump administration has disagreed with that interpretation, and courts have split on that question. And so it's, an open question on kind of whether that educational law prohibits discrimination on the basis of sexual orientation and gender identity. Similarly, in the healthcare context, the Affordable Care Act has a provision that prohibits discrimination in accessing healthcare on the basis that includes, among other things, prohibition on sex discrimination. And again, there's that similar debate and kind of back and forth on interpreting whether that law covers sexual orientation and gender identity. It's probably no surprise to anyone here that given my background in the Biden administration and the work that I do now, I very much view the law as covering sexual orientation and gender identity, particularly given the logic of the Bostock decision. There are other, in the housing context as well, the Federal Housing Act prohibits discrimination on the basis of sex. And so similarly, there are all these federal laws where there's just this back and forth on whether or not they cover sexual orientation and gender identity.
I think it's really important that you said earlier before you started that there was state level, right, and then there's federal, and that's an important distinction, but there's also overlap when it comes between the two. And there's some kind of general rules when you have, something that arises at the state level or at a work as an individual citizen that can arise to a federal level kind of ordeal. So if someone, for those who are not, aware of some of the protections that they have, what are some of if someone believes that they're experiencing discrimination at work or at school because of their sexual orientation, gender identity, what are some practical steps that they should make or take immediately?
I think the most important thing that folks can do is just not sit and wait. If you believe you've experienced discrimination, which can happen in a whole bunch of different ways that we can get into and talk about, because there are different kind of legal theories that support a claim of discrimination. But if you believe you've been discriminated, there are very strict timelines in most cases on when you have to file an action to assert your right to challenge that discrimination. So, for instance, in the employment context, depending on the state that you're in, you might only have 180 days, whereas in some places it's up to over 300 days. That's still really not a lot of time if you think about all the billions of things that we're all dealing with on a daily basis. And so it's just, incredibly important that folks, if they believe they've been subject to discrimination, reach out to an attorney and take action immediately. So that's number one. And number two, if particularly in the employment context, but really, in education as well, go through the formal reporting structures within your entity. Depending on the nature of the claim that you're bringing and who you're potentially suing, whether or not you went through that process could have a bearing on the ultimate analysis and outcome that comes out of the case. And so, even if you think, well, if I go to HR, nothing's going to happen, or if I go to my school administrator, nothing's going to happen, it is still worth taking that step to do so. Again, number one, because oftentimes that's a necessary step for part of the analysis. And then number two, those entities sometimes, particularly in the education context, have other legal obligations that kick in once reports are made. And that also can unlock additional claims that you may have if the school that you're in, for instance, doesn't follow the necessary requirements and doesn't protect your rights in that way. The third, big category of practical steps that I would say is document everything, put things in writing, keep notes for yourself, write the date and time that you're taking the notes and when certain events occurred, maintain documentary evidence that you can. And The only caveat there is, you don't want to violate any company policy that might exist on, sending emails to personal emails to your personal inbox, for example. But certainly, like, as things are happening, let's say you're subject to consistent discrimination and harassment by someone, every time that happens, write it down, write what happened, as much detail as possible, include the date and time that it happened, include the date and time that you're writing the note, include any steps that you took to then go report it to HR, for instance. Keep, copies of the reports that you're filing with HR. It'll just make, life much easier when you're then trying to vindicate your rights, if you go down that route.
Yeah, absolutely. I think some of what you said is just some of the most important pieces of it, right? The documentation piece. I want to flesh that out a little bit. What are some of the common mistakes that people make when trying to document discrimination? Because you mentioned a couple things there of I didn't even think of the policy, right? Of sending an email to your personal account, maybe violating that, and what are some of those common mistakes?
Yeah, so I think that's a big one that, in an effort to try to preserve information, someone ends up getting themselves into trouble legitimately by violating company policy, for instance. I think another way I've seen folks get into trouble is less on the documentary side, but trying to record conversations. And that, different states have different laws on whether you need both parties' consent to record a conversation versus only one party's consent to do so. I think, not having enough detail in the notes that one takes for themselves is also kind of a big gap that I've seen before where, it'll just have the date and time and like the person's name. And you really want to kind of be as thorough as you can in the kind of documentary process.
Absolutely. And so, if a person's in this situation, what kind of resources or organizations are available to LGBTQ individuals and that they just need to know about if they need legal assistance or support?
So I think there are a few. The first, which again, I don't think this will be a surprise that I'm going to say this first, is Glad Law. We have Glad Law Answers, which is a free information line that can be accessed both by phone and online. While that is largely designed to provide information to people, we also have a lawyer referral service there, and so can potentially connect folks with legal counsel who might be interested in helping them out. Similarly, one of our coalition partners, Lambda Legal, has a similar information line. So folks could always reach out to them. Within different states, there are different equality organizations. So like Equality Massachusetts, Equality Ohio, and a lot of them have either information lines or just general resources and referral services for attorneys and others and advocates who may be able to help. And then the last batch of resources that I would point out, which is not LGBTQ specific, are number one, legal aid organizations. Even if you yourself, so number one, if you yourself are financially eligible for their services, they're just an incredible community resource to help people vindicate their rights, including in the employment context. But if you're not financially eligible for their service, usually most will still provide referrals. And so that's a way to find attorneys who might be able to help you. And then similarly, state and city bar associations likewise have, for the most part, really robust referral services where you can reach out to them, say, I've experienced X or Y, or click through and go through some prompts, and they can provide you with resources of folks who may be able to help.
And for the service providers or educators, community leaders, anyone that's really joining us today that can provide services or education to others, what are some concrete ways that they can create a safer and more affirming environments?
I think a few ways. Number one is if someone comes with a complaint, it needs to be investigated swiftly and thoroughly and respectfully. I think taking that step is not only a legal obligation, but is a critical step in ensuring that employees and others are actually heard, and that their experiences are not only validated, but that there's redress if there was in fact wrongdoing. So number one is just taking all allegations of discrimination, harassment, and so forth seriously, and immediately kind of kicking into gear on those investigations. I think as important as that, though, is both having an anti-retaliation policy in effect if someone comes and does lodge a complaint internally, and then actually enforcing that anti-retaliation policy. Because most places will have the anti-retaliation policy, but taking the actual steps to enforce it and make sure that it's abundantly clear that there will be zero retaliation for lodging complaints of harassment and discrimination is incredibly important. And then, beyond that, I think, for employers in particular, taking a look at, what benefit policies exist and the scope of coverage that exists there. So is the health insurance policy, for example, really LGBTQ plus inclusive in all of the ways that it needs to be? Ensuring that policies are is, another way to ensure inclusion and equality. And then, I think there are like on the ground steps that folks can be taking, create that environment, like respecting, ensuring that there's respect for individuals' names and pronouns, and reflecting that in emails, and steps like that.
Absolutely. And thank you for those suggestions. I mean, those are all extremely important. And I kind of want to take a step back now and kind of delve back into our topic a little more broadly as we're about like a week out from Juneteenth. I think we'd be remiss if we didn't highlight the experiences of LGBTQ plus people of color. And I wanted to kind of ask you, how does race, gender identity, sexual orientation, and economic status create a unique kind of barrier for many individuals that you've seen
Mm.
in your experience?
Federal civil rights law was largely built around single access claims. So claims on the basis of race, or claims on the basis of gender, or claims on the basis of sexual orientation. And that's not how people walk through the world. And so what that often means is that both legally and looking at kind of the data, it means LGBTQ plus people of color often fall through the gaps. That their specific experience isn't, additively protected, it's structurally underrecognized. And so kind of look across different sectors, in the in employment, for instance, LGBTQ plus people of color face discrimination at higher rates than both white LGBTQ plus people and straight or cis people of color, because the layered intersectionality is creating disadvantages in hiring, promotion, and retention. I think similarly, you look at statistics around safety, and between 2017 and 2023, more than 6 in 10 gun homicides of transgender and gender expansive people were Black transgender women, and 1 in 10 were of trans Latina women. And that's not a marginal disparity, that's a structural one. Similarly, I think we could go across all of the different axes here in healthcare as well. Research shows that intersectional discrimination occurs in healthcare as well, where racial disparities in physician relationships stack with anti-LGBTQ plus bias, producing worse care and less trust in the physicians that folks are going to. Again, it's both the laws aren't matching how people are actually moving through the world. The intersectionality that exists creates layers of disparities that stack on top of one another. And then the law is not built to reflect and address that reality, but instead, again, as part of, going back to like the underlying structure that exists here, it's structurally designed to under-recognize this and just be focused on these narrow classifications.
I mean, it's amazing as we talk even more, like I can tell you've had so much experience in health, education, and even with economic justice, right? And when you kind of bring that into your work, what kind of lessons have you learned along the way and with all of that experience to help you strengthen and kind of further that advancement of advocacy?
This is something I and my team think about a lot, particularly kind of given the last few years where LGBTQ plus issues, and in particular the rights of transgender individuals has really been treated as though it's something that is taking away from other people. I think one of the things that I continually go back to is LGBTQ folks care about economic and racial justice just as much as anybody else. And when we talk about shrinking the economic wealth gap that exists in this country, that is not something that just impacts non-LGBTQ people. What the minimum wage is, whether people are treated with dignity at work, whether people have access to affordable health care. Those are also LGBTQ plus issues. And so as I think about advocacy, the more that we're able to recenter the narrative on how we're all in this together, that it really is, in particular, kind of the ruling economic class against everybody else. When it's a recast in that way, I think it strengthens the ability for straight cis folks to connect with queer advocates and queer individuals.
I totally 100% agree. And so when we talk about that connection, right, and it stems from just the humanity of it all, how can we help our young people, our youth right now through some of the struggles and challenges that we've seen? And letting them know that it takes us all and that the unity of it all can, bring us together and close those wealth gaps and close those healthcare gaps and everything under that.
It's a really good question, particularly, as we've seen the last few years, particularly with anti-LGBTQ plus victimization kind of increasing, both like on the ground in states across the country and now by the federal government. There really is just a ever increasing impact on young queer folks and in particular their mental health and their physical safety. What the data show are that these impacts, the bullying, the threats of violence, the mental health impacts, they're not intrinsic, they are not an intrinsic feature of being LGBTQ plus. They're tracked directly with how young people are treated, which means they are responsive to policy and environment. And so what that means, in terms of what we can be doing, it means fighting back against the rhetoric that the federal administration and that certain state governments are lodging against trans folks, because on the ground, that translates into bullying and harassment from peer to peer. Similarly, at the same time that the federal government rescinds federal policies that protect LGBTQ youth, it's all the more important for states and local governments to be, if not only augmenting the policies that they have, but robustly enforcing the policies that they have to show youth that you are safe, you are part of the community, we see you, you are equal, because that really does matter. And then I think there are gaps that have been created by some of the funding choices of the current administration. I think the most notable one is the federal support for the Trevor Project's safety hotline for individuals, going through acute mental health crisis. And that's where community-based organizations, where financial support to an organization like the Trevor Project is just invaluable, so that those resources do exist to help young folks navigate through situations that are being caused by the highest level of government.
And you spoke a lot there about policy and about the things being done in the budget rollbacks and how it works at the government level. You've served as an associate counsel to the president, so you've been in that White House setting. What kind of surprised you most about how policy is created and implemented? Like the creation, like watching the sausage, what surprised you?
It shouldn't have surprised me because it's something that everyone says, but it was shocking to me the degree to which this is true, which is just how much personnel matters. that the people who are in different roles, it just matters so much for what policy can actually make it out the door or not. And the reason for that, particularly at the federal level, is because the apparatus is so large, there is really only so much that makes it up kind of each rung of the level. And so whether or not you have someone that cares deeply about, pushing protections for LGBTQ plus youth at assistant secretary level at one of the departments really matters. And similarly, whether or not folks in the president's domestic policy council who are making a lot of decisions related to, what gets out the door and doesn't, often on, the whims of what they think will move the needle and or will be salient with folks across the country. The people in those positions, it just matters so much.
So like the people matter, right? And so the people that aren't in those positions, how can they create change? What kind of we think of litigation, we think of lawyers, we think of politicians, we think of the president, people in those positions. How can the people without that experience or background make change? What advocacy tools are available to communities beyond filing a lawsuit?
I think change can be made at every possible level. And so starting from the ground up, thinking back to the fight for marriage equality, that wasn't just a legal strategy, right? That happened because public opinion changed, because number one, an increasing number of folks came out, which meant an increasing number of people knew or related to or were friends with a queer person. And number two, because people had difficult and conversations with people they knew. They had conversations about why they wanted to get married and why the laws prohibiting marriage equality impacted them and their families, and how conversely, allowing them to get married, would serve the same kind of core goals that the person they were talking to was trying to achieve in their marriage. And so that lesson I do not think is just true in the marriage equality context. I think, when you think about the debate we're having that we've been thrust into on transgender rights issues, having difficult conversations with folks who may not come in with the same priors um, is invaluable. Like, you want to talk about change, like that's where it starts. Talking person to person, family member to family member, neighbor to neighbor, talking about the experience that you have, talking about the experience that your friends have, what you see. It's kind of number one in trying to move people from where they are. I think relatedly, so much we get so focused on what's happening at the federal level, and it is incredibly important. But in terms of people's day-to-day lives, a lot of that is shaped by local government, so city and county government. And there are a lot of opportunities to make real progress um, via local government, whether that is attending a block club meeting and advocating for a change, whether that is going to open comment at your local city council and advocating for a specific ordinance, whether it's running for that office yourself, whether it's trying to get a ballot initiative on the ballot for your city or state. There's just so many protections that can be added at that level that all of us can be working to achieve. And then I think, in addition to kind of those aspects, I think, public education is critically important. And so whether that's through work, whether that's through organizing, again, kind of big picture, large scale communications and education is essential. And then there are the various legal lanes that I can, talk about in more depth related to policy advocacy at higher levels of government, or, litigation paths, or advocating for or against different regulations at different levels of government.
Absolutely. And I think one thing that you said earlier really stuck with me. It was there's a lot going on at the at the federal level, right? There's a lot of shocking on our media. There's a lot of different headlines and stories coming out. But kind of looking forward, right? What gives you hope now in the fight for equality?
So what I always say to this, which is genuinely true in how I feel, but it sounds wild, which is while we have not been in this exact moment before, we have been through moments that have been as perilous and difficult before. And I think, I'll stick to the LGBTQ movement. What we've always seen is progress and backlash, progress and backlash. And it's never just a pure, forward line, but we're always trending in that direction. And so, you think about, for example, in the 1980s, the Supreme Court ruled that laws banning same-sex sodomy were constitutional and lawful. And then less than 20 years later, the Supreme Court completely reversed course and said, actually, there's a fundamental right to privacy that makes these laws unconstitutional. And then that case becomes a stepping stone for a challenge to DOMA, the Defense of Marriage Act, and marriage equality. Similarly, in the 1980s, you have a government that completely turns its back on queer individuals who were being ravaged by HIV/AIDS and Black individuals who were similarly disproportionately impacted by the plague. And 30 to 40 years later, we have a situation that is not by any means resolved. We still have significant inequities when it comes to fighting against HIV and AIDS. And we're also in a world where affordable access to medications that can prevent the disease entirely is at a scale that could not have even been dreamed of in the 1980s. And so that's just a long way of saying what gives me hope right now is there's a resilience in us as a community, along with the resilience in other communities that continues to push, and that notwithstanding the difficult moment that we find ourselves in right now, history always shows that we will get out of it and we will still make progress and we will still end up in a forward moving place, even if it doesn't feel like it in this exact moment. And even if there is a significant amount of pain and harm in the moment that I don't want to discount by that hope, but that's what history would tell us.
Absolutely, and I 100% agree. And if you were speaking directly to a young person who is LGBTQ plus or considering a career in advocacy, public service, law, etc., what would you want them to know?
I think change is hard and you have to play kind of the long game. Those who are opposed to equality, those who are opposed to reproductive autonomy, they have always and will always play a 50-year game. Their strategy will last decades so for them to achieve their ends. And I think for anyone who's interested in doing work on the kind of pro-equality side, we're not going to solve it all in one action. We're not going to solve it all in one day. And we need to be thinking 30, 40, 50 years down the road in how we approach the work. And so I think, more than anything, if you're coming into this space, like we welcome you, please come do the work. Having that long-term vision and knowing that it's the long haul is incredibly important.
And I think it's just, I'm going to throw this question in there because it was something that I've been wondering as well, but it's also really important as we're on the topic of young people. How did your experience at the White House kind of shape your understanding of leadership?
It's a great question. I think number one, it showed me that great leaders provide vision, but then they also trust. They surround themselves with people that they can trust to effectuate that vision. And so, I'm thinking in particular, I worked most closely with the deputy White House counsel and then the White House counsel himself. And they really, would set, with the president's guidance, what, our marching orders were, but just exhibited a level of trust in us and, provided us a level of autonomy that really allowed us to go and, do the work that we were tasked with doing. And so, number one is having that vision, but also being able to step back and allow your folks to effectuate it. I think similarly, it's surrounding yourself with people who are smarter than you. that it's recognizing that you don't have all of the answers, that a diversity of viewpoints strengthens rather than detracts from the ultimate kind of decision that'll be made. And I think great leaders are not afraid of being wrong and or not being the smartest one or having all the answers, and instead learning from and relying on the expertise and experience of the folks that they surround themselves with.
I think that was perfectly put. And before we kind of wrap up on our last question, or when as I'm asking this, after this, we're going into our Q&A and just having people who are here with us ask you questions. I want to ask you, because at the Just Us movement, we talk often about empowering individuals through education and advocacy, right? That's really one of our big goals here. What's one action that you hope every attendee takes from today and implements into the world?
I think it's one I've said before, but I really think it's just so critical, which is have a respectful, patient conversation with someone you disagree with on an issue you care deeply about.
I think that's beautiful. I mean, it's we're gonna always have those hard conversations or have those opportunities to have those hard conversations. You just kind of have to have the guts to have them, right?
There's a commonality in all, like I think about the debate about transgender athletes, and I go to the fact that underlying the like sensationalization of that debate, there's actually so much underneath that that draws people together on it. That there's an agreement that, sports for young folks can be an incredibly important learning opportunity and opportunity to engage with other folks and to learn what it means to be working in a team. And there's commonality that, oh, some sports are different. Not all of them involve contact. And, kindergarten isn't the same thing as the NCAA. And so I really do think, even where it appears that there is the most fervent disagreement on an issue, this isn't universally true, but for most of us, there are these common threads that connect us where you can still make some progress with folks.
And thank you so much for that. I mean, at this point, I want to open it up to the audience and see if anybody has any questions for Josh. And as I've been watching and hearing you speak, I actually do have another one. So how do these organizations like GLAD kind of prioritize the things that you see here
Yeah.
get through the door? Because I'm sure there's a lot that, surfaces.
Yeah. It's something we struggle with routinely to balance the desire to want to intervene everywhere when we see wrongdoing with the reality that there's only so many of us on the team, and so there's only so much capacity that we have. It differs obviously by organization. We have kind of an internal process where we have kind of a number of parameters that guide our decision-making process, including, what's the impact? What would the impact be if we were successful? How would this potentially change the law? In what specific ways? What are the racial and economic justice implications of doing the work? And relatedly, what are the underlying structures in terms of racial and economic justice that led to the problem that we're identifying in the first place? We consider things like whether anybody else is doing it or not. So, because we don't want to duplicate work, and how coalition and community-based partners fit into it. And then, our model is one where we aim to get consensus as a legal team to make our decisions. But again, that, it's, I think, varies widely by organizations and how they prioritize. And even that it's very much a work in progress, because the impulse in all of us is, particularly in the moment right now, we want to say yes to everything.
I can only imagine there has to be like so many like interesting cases come in, but some that like pull at the heartstrings, some that you have to give attention to. But also there's like people who've been waiting and other priorities that they're there. So I can definitely understand that.
For sure. And especially given the nature of work that we do, where it's impact focused rather than individual representation focused, that we very often have to say no, because even though we want to work on the specific issue that that person is experiencing, we're looking for a specific type of case or a specific fact pattern and so forth.
One more for me before we wrap up. I was looking through your bio and I thought it was just so cool. You worked on the $6 billion kind of debt relief, student loan debt relief, and just how was that? Like, what was that like? Like, were you like in a war room? Like, all right, we're gonna have to do this, and that, because I can only imagine how tense it was at that time from, one half of the nation and then the other half like asking, begging for help.
So when we initially brought the case that led to that, it actually wasn't even seeking to get all of that debt discharged as an initial step. It was that in the first Trump administration, they had completely stopped deciding claims of fraud by folks who went to for-profit colleges. And so the initial aim of the lawsuit was just to get them to restart making those decisions. Then they would theoretically, the theory was they'll restart making decisions and we can challenge those decisions and kind of go after the debt relief then. But a whole bunch of things happened where the case morphed and ultimately ended in, the settlement that led to that discharge. As exciting as that is, and as exciting as it has been to watch, and from a different perch now, folks get that relief. I think it's also a case study in where sometimes the federal government is not built to meet people where they are and to actually serve folks. Because in addition to everything that necessitated the lawsuit in the first place, where the federal government, really failed these folks who had been defrauded by their schools. That lawsuit is actually still ongoing, and the effectuation of the settlement is still ongoing, and not everybody has gotten the relief yet because of how long it has taken to try to get that out the door, and then the shifts in the administration and all of that.
Got it. That's really interesting. I didn't even know the background behind all of it, so I'm just really happy it happened because that helped out a lot of people. But thank you. And if anybody else had any questions, now's the time. Hearing none. All right. I just want to thank you so much, Josh, for taking the time out to speak with us and dropping a whole ton of knowledge on us because we really need it at this vital time in our nation's history, especially with some of the current events happening. We have a lot of things in store, and I'm sure that you have a lot of work on your plate. So we really appreciate you taking the time out. As we look forward into the future for the Just Us movement, we have a ton of webinars coming up in the future. Our next one being in August surrounding libraries and the importance of them in our nation's history, also with us leading into the future. So if all of you in attendance would like to join that and come to that, the information on that is in our link tree, and you can also find more information on our website at thejustusmovement.net. Follow us on social media where you can connect with us, Just Us Movement. And we also have a few announcements coming up in the near future. So please follow us on our social media platforms so you can see. And also on our link tree, you can sign up for our email subscription as well, so you can get some of the special messages. Again, thank you so much, Josh, and I hope you stay safe and you know, just keep doing the work and fighting the good fight. We really appreciate the work that you're doing, and we hope that everybody on your side is successful.
Thanks so much for having me.
All right. Everybody have a great evening and thank you for coming.